Hey everybody, this is Eugene. I'm in Santa Clara waiting on the 522 bus as part of my travels. I wanted to show you some video I found from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission's committee on basically programming and allocations. In that video from July 14th, you'll hear Supervisor Cindy Chavez, who was part of that committee, discuss her concerns about the future of buses in Santa Clara County. You'll also hear testimony from Randi Kinman at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission expressing concern for how public transit in the Bay Area is not ready for any long-term disasters, either natural or man-made, such as the unfortunate VTA shootings on May 26th at Guadalupe Light Rail Yard. I'll have the times of the particular comments in the video that you're about to see, so enjoy. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Great, and good morning, everyone. And together with Vice Chair Pappen, I'd like to call the Programming and Allocations Committee meeting of July 14th, 2021 to order. Can staff please roll the COVID recording?
Due to COVID-19, this meeting will be conducted as a Zoom webinar pursuant to the provisions of the Governor's Executive Order N-2920, which suspends certain requirements of the Brown Act. This meeting is being webcast on the MTC website. The Chair will call upon commissioners, presenters, staff, and other speakers by name and ask that they speak clearly and state their names before giving comments or remarks. Persons participating via webcast and Zoom with their cameras enabled are reminded that their activities are visible to viewers. Commissioners and members of the public participating by Zoom wishing to speak should use
I feel like we have to hit the recorder.
It is requested that public speakers state their names and organization, but providing such information is voluntary. Written public comments received at info@bayareametro.gov by 5 p.m. yesterday will be posted to the online agenda and entered into the record, but will not be read out loud. If authors of the written correspondence would like to speak, they are free to do so. A roll call vote will be taken for all action items. Panelists and attendees should note that the chat feature is not active.
Great, and thank you very much. We'll move on to agenda item number 2. Agenda item number 2 is the consent calendar. Today, the consent calendar includes 12 items labeled.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, before we do that, can we do a roll call?
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, can the clerk please call the roll and confirm quorum?
Absolutely. Abakoga?
Here.
Chavez?
Here.
El-Twanzi?
Here.
Glover? Commissioner Glover is here. Miley?
Here.
Pappen?
Here.
Rabbit?
Here.
Ronan?
Here.
And Worth is absent. Quorum is present.
Great, I apologize for that. Trying to get down to business right away,
No problem.
which is the consent calendar. And it is, there are 12 items on there, 2A through 2L. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns with today's consent calendar?
I would move the consent calendar.
So I have a motion from Director Glover and a second from Director
Chavez.
Thank you so much. And can I ask the clerk to read any public comments received associated to this item into the record?
Sure. I've received nothing in writing for this item, and I have no raised hands from members of the public.
Great. Then can we call the roll, please, to vote for the consent calendar today?
Okay, with a motion by Glover, second by Chavez. Abakoga?
Aye.
Chavez?
Yes.
Glover?
Yes.
Miley?
Yes.
Pappen?
Yes.
Rabbit?
Aye.
Ronan?
Aye.
Worth is absent, and the motion passes unanimously by all members present.
Great. Thank you all very much. With that, we'll move on to agenda item 3A. It's MTC Resolution 4481. It's the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, Phase 1 distribution. This proposes the programming of approximately $912 million of American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, or ARP funding, to Bay Area transit operators to provide funding relief for revenue losses and ongoing financial uncertainty as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And before I introduce Teresa Ramel to take this task forward, just want to say thank you to staff. This is now the third time through these pandemic distributions, and staff does tremendous work to try to get the dollars where they're needed. This is a unique one in probably the last cycle that we're going to see, that might have to last a few fiscal years or more, setting the stage for the future. So I just want to say thank you to staff for all the work that they've done. I think that we have some little minor tweaks to probably discuss, but with that, we'll move to Teresa Ramel to present the item. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit, and good morning, committee members. We do have a presentation for this item. There we go. So today we'll be proposing a partial distribution, or what we're calling phase 1 of American Rescue Plan Act funding. Prior to discussing staff's proposed distribution, I'd like to walk you through a bit of the lead up to today's recommendation. As background, last March, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 appropriated $30.5 billion in pandemic relief for public transit, of which the Bay Area received nearly $1.7 billion in transit formula funding to the 12 federally designated urbanized areas, or UZAs. MTC, as the designated recipient of those funds, is responsible for programming them. You can move to the next slide, please. In May, the Commission adopted a set of principles to guide the distribution of ARP funding. These principles, in summary, included, number 1, to stabilize and sustain transit. So but I think we went 1, 2, there we go, thanks. To stabilize and to sustain transit. So funds should be used to ensure the financial sustainability and stability of the region's transit operators. Number 2, restore and reimagine service. Funds should be distributed with the understanding that operators will restore service to support both current and recovering demand. And number 3, improve customer experience. Funds should be used to promote and sustain transit usage in the region for the long term in a way that both attracts and retains transit riders through investments to improve the customer experience. Next slide, please. In June, commissioners had the opportunity to hear directly from transit operators on their experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as their outlooks for fiscal year 2022 and beyond at a special programming and allocations workshop that was held. As was heard at the workshop, there was optimism over the return of riders, but that was balanced with concern over the pace of recovery and continued uncertainty over post-pandemic commute patterns and continued impacts on operator finances. As you can see from this slide, as of May, ridership remained depressed at only 71% of pre-COVID ridership on average. And of course, there's quite a bit of variability among agencies in terms of ridership. Even though operators are planning to deliver a level of service that will outpace expected ridership demand in the coming fiscal year, there is significant concern over committing to service and staffing levels that cannot be financially sustained if the pandemic's recovery is not robust. Following the workshop at the Commission meeting later in June, staff presented several recommendations based on takeaways from the special workshop. Number 1, we recommended that ARP funding be distributed in multiple tranches to allow for near-term service improvements, but also flexibility to gauge the recovery's progress and fund sustainable service that best fits customers' needs. Number 2, maintain a needs-based framework that is conducive to sustaining Bay Area operators in a unique and unprecedented emergency-driven framework. And number 3, we recommended to set aside funds for future allocation to advance Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force initiatives. Next slide, please. So with that lead up, we are now ready to recommend a first phase of ARP funding distribution and set-asides. We're recommending the programming of approximately $912 million in ARP funding for transit operators, in addition to a set-aside of less than 10% of total ARP funds for Blue Ribbon Task Force initiatives, operator hardships, and focused recovery strategies. I'll briefly describe the distribution approach for the $912 million in recommended phase 1 funding. However, you can find additional detail on the rationale and methodology for the distribution in the attachments to your summary memo for this item. So first, in our approach, we want to preserve future flexibility. We recommend distributing 60% of the ARP funds, less set-asides, now and preserving the remainder for a later distribution in order to preserve the region's ability to respond to changing circumstances. We also want to maintain financial need as a central part of the distribution. The distribution should provide operators with needs-based relief to replace lost revenues in keeping with legislative intent and our past approach to both CARES and CRISA. Next, this distribution incentivizes service restoration by providing a funding incentive to restore service levels on top of backfilling forecasted revenue losses over the coming fiscal year. I want to emphasize the word incentive here, and we're not trying to distribute an exact amount needed by each operator to restore service levels, but rather to provide a cushion on top of fully backfilling revenue losses to pre-COVID budget levels moving into fiscal year 2022. Next, this approach would help to level the financial footing among operators by ensuring all operators receive an ARP funding allocation, but also taking into consideration the total amount of federal relief funds operators received relative to their losses. Next, to be responsive to direction we've heard from many commissioners, this approach sets aside a portion, less than 10% of ARP funds, for a combination of Blue Ribbon Task Force initiatives, specific operator hardships and disparities, and focused recovery efforts. And last but not least, this distribution approach reinforces coordination efforts in Solano and Sonoma counties by allowing operators and CTAs to collaborate on how best to distribute ARP funds to operators. So you will see that the distribution amounts for operators in Solano and Sonoma counties have been combined into lump sums, which we anticipate being able to program to specific operators in September. Next slide, please. In the weeks preceding today's recommendation, MTC staff worked with transit operator stakeholders in an attempt to build consensus on the proposed distribution approach and operator funding shares. There has been a lot of support among transit operators, and I believe as a part of this item's materials, you will find a letter of support signed by 6 out of 7 of our large operators, plus several smaller operators. That said, no methodology is going to be perfect for everyone, and this slide summarizes some of the ongoing concerns that we have heard expressed. First of all, there remains continued conflict with some operators with the proposed needs-based focus, in that it does not fully align to how funds were apportioned to and within urbanized areas. To this issue, staff maintains that distributing ARP funds on a needs basis is in alignment with the intent of the federal government for the use of these funds and critical to maintaining operator financial sustainability going forward. There's also been some consternation that the incentive funding that I had mentioned that was added to the revenue backfill component of the distribution formula is not based on the exact cost of restoring service. The calculation used to establish the incentive funding amounts is based on each operator's cost per service hour, capped at the highest cost of the 7 large operators. I will add here that the cost per revenue vehicle hour is calculated using the same pre-COVID operating cost information provided by operators that was used in the CARES and CRISA distributions. Staff felt it best to maintain a consistent basis of information in determining the ARP distribution, rather than switching to alternative sources. Another concern was that the incentive funding doesn't acknowledge that some operators kept service hours high throughout the pandemic. We do acknowledge that some operators provided higher levels of ongoing service during the pandemic than others. However, there's just not a good way of gauging whether adjustments to service were warranted to accommodate demand or even wise given available resources. There's no one-size-fits-all path related to service adjustments. Given that the incentive funds are on top of what is needed to backfill lost revenues to pre-pandemic levels, and the fact that all operators are guaranteed a minimum level of funding in our proposal, we did not feel this concern warranted a change to the proposal. And lastly, several operators expressed the importance of using actual or more informed forecasts of revenue losses, as well as an evaluation of service restoration as key considerations in future funding phases. And we agree that the distribution of future phases should be informed by the actual recovery and how well restored service aligns with customer needs. And to that end, a review of assumptions and actual occurrences prior to the distribution of a future phase is likely warranted. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a summary of the distribution amounts for the large operators and the smaller operators combined. Note that with the approval of the proposed ARP distribution shown in peach on the slide, a total of nearly $3.2 billion in COVID relief will have been distributed since the start of the pandemic. Next slide, please. In terms of next steps, in the remaining summer and upcoming fall, we will be continuing to monitor the status of ridership, transit service levels, and revenue. In addition, following completion of the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force Transformation Action Plan, we will work with the Commission to develop an investment plan for a portion of the proposed $157 million set aside for Blue Ribbon Task Force initiatives. We will also work with the Commission and transit operators to address any unique operator hardships or focus recovery efforts with the remaining set-aside funds. Later in the fall or early winter, we plan to return to this committee with an update on the status of ridership and financial recovery. And we will also be developing a proposal for a phase 2 distribution of some or all of the remaining ARP funds. So with that, that's my presentation. I would ask that the committee refer Resolution 4481 to the full commission for approval, and I am happy to respond to questions.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'll look to my colleagues to see if there are questions, comments, and concerns, and Director Abby Koba.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the presentations. And I appreciate staff's hard work on this item. I participated in the workshop and was very insightful for me as a new board member to hear from the various transit agencies and the unique challenges each one faces. I have to call out, though, I can't not call out our challenge here in the South Bay with VTA, and as you all know, we faced a worldwide news-making tragedy recently, and I guess I was just struck by the funding distribution, and I guess my question is, would that, what we are facing in terms of the loss of light rail service and trying to bring that back as quickly as possible, a hardship that we could perhaps count on in this next phase of funding for more assistance, because I know it's taken a time for our agency to do an inventory of what the needs are, and I think those are starting to come to fruition. And I definitely believe we will be needing extra assistance. So could we be counting on that in future phases? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Anyone else from the commission, committee? Try to go in order that the hands were raised. Director Connolly.
Thank you. I think Jim may have beat me out, but appreciate the opportunity, as well as I'm not on this committee, but just wanted to quickly flag a couple of issues and also thank staff for the great presentation and obviously the amount of work that's gone into the allocation process. So speaking on behalf of smaller operators in the North Bay, namely in Marin and Sonoma counties, Some of the issues have been flagged, but just wanted to go over a couple of specifics and really start with, the operators are very grateful for the continued federal support. It really has allowed them to make up for lost local and state revenue and to continue to provide vital services during the pandemic. So the couple of concerns on the distribution formula for Marin and Sonoma small operators, there are data inconsistencies, and the formula does not seem to account for cases such as in the case of Marin Transit, where operators have actually added service during the pandemic in order to meet demand. And in the case of SMART, where new service was added just prior to the pandemic and is not reflected in the 2019 NTD data, greater resources are needed in order to maintain service levels going forward. So the request, just to get to the point, would be to respectfully ask MTC staff and the commission to consider addressing these situations by using a portion of the 10% set-asides hardship or disparities allowance going forward. Marin Transit is requesting an additional $2.4 million for a total of $7.2 million from ARP. This is the amount needed to maintain the current adjusted service levels, i.e. increased service levels for 2 years, accounting for revenue loss and expected service cost increases. And then Sonoma County Transit Agency is requesting an additional $7.7 million for a total of $23.2 million from ARP. This is the amount needed to restore to 100% pre-pandemic service for 3 years, accounting for revenue loss and service cost escalation. So just wanted to get that in the record. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Director Spearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Teresa, this is excellent work and great presentation. So thank you. I want to kind of piggyback on Commissioner Connolly's comments that, I think the North Bay has some very specific challenges, and I hope staff looks at that. But changing subject there, I'm going to put on my blue ribbon chairman hat. Sonoma County has made a request for $750,000 to continue that transit integration effort. With all the work that the blue ribbon is doing, where we're trying to get these smaller operators to consolidate, higher coordination, higher cooperation. This phase 2 in Sonoma County is dealing with the wayfindings, fare integration, the scheduling, transferring, the very things that we're asking the small operators to do. And I would, and maybe this question's for Alex, that I really would like to see that kind of separated from all of this debate on the other money, because it's an opportunity to really start bringing those smaller operators together, something we've been working on at the commission for 20, 30 years. And, so Alex or Teresa, I don't know if you can respond to that, but I really would like to be able to identify either the set aside from the blue ribbon or some other funding source that we actually make that commitment to that effort, for that phase 2 integration of the transit efforts. So Alex or Teresa, can somebody respond to that?
Yeah, good morning, Commissioners. Alex Bockelman, Deputy Executive Director for Policy. You may recall in June, the Commission also set aside just under $6 million to support some blue ribbon efforts out of your Safe and Seamless Quick Strike money. And we were aware of, again, the good work that's happening in Sonoma and Solano with respect to some of these integration efforts that really do align very well with some of the accelerated actions that are coming out of Blue Ribbon. So I think what we were hoping to do is come back as early as September with a recommendation to use some of that money to fund those efforts. So obviously we'd like to hear more from the Commission, but that was what thoughts that staff had about that.
Okay, I mean, it just, Alex, it just seems like with all the work that they've done in that first phase, that the second phase really brings it all together. And it aligns with all of the goals and objectives of the Blue Ribbon and what this commission has adopted in the past. And I just think that it's an opportunity that should not be squandered. And for this very meager rounding error, it's going to, produce some pretty good benefits in Sonoma County for transit integration. And so I hope staff looks at it that way, and maybe even treat it as the conclusion of a model project of something that other counties can do. I know Contra Costa County has done a lot of this work, and I just hate to see this effort just fall short, especially with such a modest investment. So I'd like staff to consider, singling that out and making sure that that project gets funded. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And as a Sonoma County supervisor, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I do think that it is right in line with what we've been talking about, and we need to put it at rest and actually fund it and walk the talk. In my words, where it comes from, Alex, I leave that up to you and your magic books.
Mr. Chairman, I meant to mention that you and I both have been advocating for this through the Blue Ribbon, and so thank you for those additional comments.
Now, in Sonoma County, we actually got to the place where to really truly move forward beyond where we are at now, it will take some additional resources. And eventually, as we hopefully do consolidate where it makes sense to become more efficient, that's going to be the case again and replicate throughout the Bay Area. So I look forward to that. Commissioner Josefowicz.
Thank you. So I think this is really terrific work, and I'm constantly impressed how staff has managed to kind of, address such a complex situation in such a quick amount of time over the course of these various federal relief packages. And in particular, I wanted to just call out how I think it's really the right decision to be doing these distributions based on need. And how I know that that's not always the easiest thing to do, and it's relatively complex, but then I think that's really what I think is going to serve the transit riders best, and is what's going to serve this region best. I hope that as we go forward into the next and final round of federal distributions, that we can do even more to try and align the distributions with kind of the future state of our transit systems, and that as it becomes clearer and clearer that we're not going back to the pre-pandemic, like whatever we're going to, it's not going to be back to what it was before. If we can kind of be, finding ways to support agencies transitioning to that future state, and looking at kind of the need of that future state, and not just looking backwards. And I know this, as these distributions have gone on, we balanced that more, but I hope we continue to do that. And I don't know exactly how to do that, but I'm sure you'll figure it out.
Thank you. Commissioner Fleming.
Hello, and thank you for hearing me, as I'm not a member of this subcommittee, but I wanted to lift up and echo the comments of a few of the commissioners who've spoken before me, Connolly, Sparing, and Rabbit. And I do agree that the needs-based assessment is the way to go for keeping the whole region going, but that in Marin and Sonoma counties, a relatively small investment would go such a long way for us and for our transit dependent riders. So I do hope that you consider this request and know that we already have worked really hard, and we will put it to good use. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Chair Pedroza.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit. And I do want to thank Alex. You've been doing this 3 times now, Alex, and you find a way to find compromise that's equitable and fair, and that most folks can really feel good about what we're doing. So those aren't just words. I think that's real action, Alex. So thank you. In terms of the hardship, I really want to echo the comments I think the Chair of the Blue Ribbon Committee, Jim Spearing, mentioned. When we talk about looking forward, the Blue Ribbon is that look forward of what we want to accomplish. And when we talk about the transformative action plan, and in that the accelerated action plan, that's the forward-thinking nature that we all get excited about. But we need to make sure we're resourcing those objectives and those outcomes that we want to achieve. So the set aside, I think, is critical. And I want to make sure that we protect that, especially as we're going to be having that commission workshop where we talk about what it takes to deliver those outcomes. So I do believe, to Commissioner Collins' point, there is an opportunity in the hardship category to rectify some of these concerns that are being raised by operators and commissioners. But we got to make sure that we collectively don't regress and don't, lose focus on what we're trying to accomplish with the Blue Ribbon Committee, because there is a lot of intentionality in what we're trying to do there. And what I would say, Alex, I think the opportunity in some of the concerns we're hearing in the second phase of the distribution of this, is there an opportunity to relook at some of these things and some of the concerns that have been raised by commissioners and operators?
Chair Pedroza, definitely in the second phase, we can certainly, as Teresa mentioned in her presentation, we can look at kind of evolving situations in terms of ridership, in terms of how the recovery is going. So that's definitely a possibility in the second phase. And as you noted, there is potentially also some room to address that within the set aside that we have. But recognizing, as you noted, that you want to make sure that you're really focusing on the outcomes and getting there for Blue Ribbon. So I think that that's sort of a balance that the commission will have to sort of establish to be able to accomplish both of those.
No, I appreciate that, Alex. And I think that is a good pathway forward. And again, just reminding the commissioners that some of the price tags to accomplish the outcomes that we're trying to do in the accelerated action plan, it's a significant resourcing that needs to happen. But that's part of, again, the look forward, and that's part of what our operators have been collaborating on and we've received support on. So again, really appreciate the direction we're on. Again, I definitely hear the concerns expressed, but I think there are pathways to addressing that. So thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Commissioner Glover?
I just want to be on record as echoing the comments of Commissioner Spearing, and yourself, Chair Rabbit, for the work that is being done with the small operators, and definitely want to just be on record in saying that my issues and concern were certainly heartfelt within his comments.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Commissioner Chavez.
Thank you. Let me start with the last point that was raised. I think if we're going to set aside money for the Blue Ribbon Commission, I think it makes a lot of sense that if we have operators that are doing what we're asking people to do, which is to combine, that should completely be funded. I think, Jim, it should come out of that fund, and it's the product of the future of the region. So I think those are really good investments. I'm not going to support the allocations put forward today, and it isn't because staff didn't work hard, they did. And I do think that staff really listened. I think, they did their best to meet the needs of the entire community, but, the impact to the Valley Transportation Authority of these actions is really, in my observation, a very downward spiral for our agency. And I'm really concerned about that. And I've shared this before, that that the impact for us in terms of how we stay in the bus business and the process we're going through in terms of recovering our light rail are very real and very meaningful. And I know to me it feels like it falls on deaf ears for all of you, that you right away hear me say wah wah wah. It isn't that. I'm telling you, I'm worried about the future of our ability to provide transit in what we think of as the heart of Silicon Valley. And one of the challenges is that for us all to be part of MTC, that we all need to believe and understand how we're helping each other move forward in a way that is in fact more equitable and allows us to plan even through COVID. So one of the requests I'm going to make is as I'm sure the board will take its final action to approve this, is to take to heart what Commissioner Abe-Koga has asked for in terms of how we think about the future. And the other is, I had requested this a while ago, but I do want to just ask staff again to send out the examination you did of all of the funding that that all of our regions get. It's a really important document. I haven't received it back and I couldn't find it in my emails, but it's one that you showed us. It might have been part of the early Blue Ribbon Commission foundational work, but it was very, very good. And it really showed how different, how all of our agencies are funded. Anyway, I think that would be helpful for me, at least as we get into this last phase of funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Pappen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to my colleagues, I think we are really trying to work together as best we can and listen to each other and each other's needs, and that will be ongoing. I want to thank the operators for working together on all of this, and really Alex and the staff for getting the money out there and working to move forward so we can make transit better. We understand the emergency that a lot are going through, and it's going to take a lot of effort. So as to Commissioner Chavez and Abikova, the tragedy that happened to the VTA has impacted us all on our hearts. But I think we need to really work together moving forward, and funding like this needs to be put to use as quickly as possible. But again, totally working together and communicating all these needs. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Anyone else from the commission? Not seeing any hands raised. Why don't we go to our attendees for public comment, and then we'll bring it back for action. Kimberly, I see Roland with his hand up.
Sure. And before we go to him, Mr. Chair, I'd like to note that there were 3 letters of correspondence received. The first was from Bay Area Transit General Managers, the second from City of Emeryville, and the third from James Schmidt and Michael Arnold. All of these have been posted to the online agenda. And with that, the first public speaker is Roland LeBrun. Please unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit and Commissioners, for your comments. So as you know, I live in Santa Clara County, and I need the VTA light rail to get to Caltrain, because we don't get Caltrain service where I live, even though I've got the station 1.5 miles from my house. I sympathize with Supervisor Chavez and Member Abikoba's request for financial support for VTA during a time of exceptional hardship. Having said that, I'm opposed to any further ARP allocations to agencies who have accumulated a total of $500 million in unspent CARES and critical funding, including $110 million at the VTA. And the last comment I'd like to make in closing is that under consent earlier today, you have just approved hundreds of millions of dollars for VTA in TDA, STA, and other funding sources. Thank you.
I see no additional raised hands from members of the public, but there is one commissioner with their hand raised, Mr. Chair.
Great, I appreciate that. Commissioner Spearing.
Chairman, did you want to take Randi Kinman first? I just wanted to have a closing comment.
Sure, we'll go to Randi. Go ahead, Randi.
Thank you. I just wanted to chime in on specifically looking at what COVID has taught us when we come to close collapse of transit systems, and what the recent tragedy with VTA has shown us when that's exacerbated by something else. In our long-range planning, we have never planned, to my knowledge, for collapse of a single transit agency, nor have we looked at the cascade effect that can happen. So I'm hoping that somewhere along the line, we nestle in the funds to do an analysis, because my concern, quite honestly, in the past has been, what happens if a North Bay fire wipes out the bus yard for any transit agency? What happens if it wipes out, if something happens and it wipes out the storage yards for AC Transit or for any of the major haulers. And we've learned with VTA that this does have a cascade effect and that we need to plan for it. And if we're going to talk about long-term resiliency, we need to take that into account moving forward. So however we maintain enough funding to look at that would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I do see one additional raised hand on our attendees list. We'll go ahead and take that if it's okay with my colleagues. Wrap up public comment and then bring it back to the board for final deliberation. So with that, Kimberly, is it?
Vita Flores, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you have 2 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my comments this morning, sort of as a late addition. I really wanted to make a comment about the North Bay counties. And in 2018 to 20, our Marin, Sonoma, Napa counties have made huge strides in creating a clean, safe environment in our transportation network and really providing that system of engagement to make sure that our Latinx community, our growing Latinx community, has opportunities for bus and transit ridership. And many of our Latinx communities work in restaurants, their nurses provide childcare, and their transportation drivers as well. And I think it's very important for MTC to take into account all the work that was done prior to COVID and really create some additional funding for this area. You know, we have a system that was lacking up here in the North Bay, in our North Bay counties, and that the work that was done needs to be acknowledged and needs to be brought forth so that everybody knows that we're trying up here in the North Bay we don't have the opportunity for BART, and we've got to maintain the transportation system that we have even with the expansion of a smart train to provide regional network transportation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And that will conclude public comment on this particular item. I will bring it back to the board and I'll go to Commissioner Spearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I hope staff can respond to Commissioner Chavez's comments. You know, historically, this commission has always looked beyond just the numbers or the formulas. You know, there's a lot of challenges that face transit operators that we can't measure. And you know, I think what Commissioner Chavez is raising is a very valid point. And, you know, I hope staff can respond. And is there a way that we can address that issue that's being raised? And is the flexibility in what's being proposed? You know, do we have that flexibility in this proposal? And, you know, I really, you know, as we allocate this money, we all know it goes to places where it probably would have been better invested somewhere else. And we need to really sharpen that pencil. But I think the issues that are being raised by Commissioner Chavez needs to be addressed. And we need to know that we have the flexibility to address that challenge. That's a major transit operation in this region. And it's one that we have to, you know, really look at what that recent tragedy, the impact that it's had. You know, those are things that we can't measure, but it's things that really do impact their ability to provide service. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that staff can kind of respond to that and assure us that flexibility is in this plan that we can address some of those issues.
This is Therese McMillan, Executive Director. So why don't I respond to that, Commissioner Spearing, and also very much appreciate the comments that not only Commissioner Chavez raised, but also Commissioner Abikoga at the beginning of the commentary. The tragedy that befell VTA was exactly the type of hardship that we were anticipating. And as staff explained, we did carve out a specific amount of funding for the types of things that don't fit neatly into, I will call this, I'm searching for a term, but when we approach the pandemic, what we as staff tried to do in this very complex and diverse area was talk about how we could structure a pandemic-related response that we knew was impacting operators in different ways. But what that shared in common was that there was a complete, fall through the floor of ridership and other things due to this unique health-induced situation. And we've been at that with 3 now different tranches, over a year. And again, kudos to the operators for working with us as we tried to set that unique framework with this unique funding source to deal with that. But as Randi Kinman and others happened, it's not like the world stops just based on that particular impact. And in VTA's case, there was a clear example of another event happening that we need to deal with. So 2 things. A, the amount that we have from the ARP amount is remarkably robust. Let's all recall $1.7 billion is a lot of money. And we're lucky in this region to be able to have that robustness that would allow us to do the type of carve out we said that allows us to remedy that. But I think what Commissioner Chavez is also pointing to, VTA is facing a much longer question of how transit should exist in their region. And I would just say at this point, this is also, this is beyond just the COVID recovery and everything else, although of course it will impact what that future looks like. And as MTC, what we try to do is work with our transit operators, looking at a broad array of what's available locally as well as regionally to address sometimes those major shifts. And I would note that the new GM that VTA just hired, Carolyn Gonat, just started, I believe, on Monday, full time. I know Carolyn very well. And one of the things that I will do is meet with her, and we can take up, I think, this larger question that VTA is grappling with, which is what is the state of play for just transit in the county, given a number of different elements. So it's a bit of a bigger question that the pandemic response is a part of and will influence. But I think the challenge and the solutions are also bigger than that. And we're definitely willing to work with them to see how we can be helpful. So that was a long response and I apologize, but hope that gets to some of the questions that have been raised.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, Therese, what the essence of the question is, do we have enough flexibility to do what you just said in this plan? And that's what I was looking for. And from what I hear you saying, we do have it.
We do have it, but I would say that the plan can contribute towards some of the challenge that VTA has outlined. But I think what Cindy's question of how are we as a county system really going to survive in the longer term, that may involve more than the capacity we have with the ARP. And that's where I think we need to have a much deeper discussion with the new GM and others to see what is that scale and what are the other tools available that the region might bring to bear to help.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. Chair Pedroza.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit. And I just concur with what Commissioner Sperry was mentioning and kind of what Therese summarized of reaching out. The reason we did the workshops, Chair, if you remember, at planning or Programming and Allocation was to accomplish this, to really understand the challenges, the unique challenges operators were facing. Obviously, I think we would benefit, Commissioner Chavez, from understanding your situation more, and same with Commissioner Abikoba. We need to understand what we have resources to accomplish, but I'm very interested in trying to understand that more. And I think, Teresa, if we can reach out to the new executive director, understand their challenges uniquely, and then what resources are available out there, right? So I think that's a great next step. And I appreciate Commissioner Chavez and Abikoba for raising that issue and understanding that we're all facing adversity differently. Some are recovering at a quicker rate, some are not, but we're vested in operators' recovery. And I think reaching out, Teresa, I think that's a good next step, keeping the flexibility, but to your point, understanding there is a resource envelope that we have in terms of what we can do, but I think there's a deeper question there that Commissioner Chavez did raise. So thank you, Chair Rabbit.
No, I appreciate that very much. And I concur actually. And I know that some of those questions have been around for a while. We need to make sure that we can kind of follow through that. With what's in front of us though, I think that, and I know that Vice Chair Pappen has a hard stop coming up and she wants to make sure she can get comment in on the next item. So if there's looking for any last comments that need to be said on this particular item, I believe what I'm hearing in terms of what's been proposed, and Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, the 750,000 set aside will come to us in September, whether it gets carried through this item or the quick strike. We'll leave that to you, but I think I'm hearing that as a concurrence of the committee. And then I'm also understanding that 10% set aside can be tweaked for some of these issues that we've been identifying. And obviously, I think the biggest one is really the actual numbers, or the more refined revenue losses, to make sure that they're reflected in the distribution allocation. And then perhaps some of those special circumstances. You know, I could just say, as someone who's involved with 3 separate transit agencies, the challenges are amazingly different for each one, whether it's Sonoma County Transit, obviously as a supervisor, SMART, the commuter rail, of which I chair, or Golden Gate Transit, which I'm the chair of finance on, all have different issues that they're dealing with and different scale of things, obviously, as well. And again, it goes to the staff's trying to find that sweet spot, which they do so well. But it's also, obviously, every agency could use more money. You know, that's a given. And really finding how we move forward on that. But as long as we have that flexibility built in, I'm certainly good going forward. So I appreciate all the comments, and I'll look to my colleagues.
Approval?
There's a motion. I'll take that as a motion from Pappen, and a second from
Ronan.
Ronan. Thank you very much. And with that, if everyone is okay taking that, carrying that forward with the idea that 10% will be figured out with some of these issues that have kind of percolated up, and we'll deal with these issues as we go forward. But it'd be good to get this thing approved today, passed on to the commission, and have that discussion perhaps a little more in the future. With that, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes, with a motion by Pappen, a second by Ronan. Abby Koga?
No.
Chavez?
No.
Excuse me. Glover?
Yes.
Miley?
Abstain.
That was an abstention. Pappen?
Yes.
Rabbit?
Aye.
Ronan?
Aye.
And Worth is absent, so the motion passes with 4 ayes, 2 nays, and 1 abstention and 1 absent.
Appreciate very much the discussion. Thank you, everyone. And I totally get where people are coming from. And we'll have continuing ongoing discussions and conversations to try to figure that path forward. With that, we'll move on to item 3B, which is the One Bay Area Grant Cycle 3. Staff's going to give an overview of the OBAG 3 initial program considerations and development schedule for committee discussion and feedback. I think I'm going to ask staff for a little deference here. Since Vice Chair Pappen needs to leave, she has some comments to make. If we could just hear her comments first, take that into consideration, and then we can move on, if that's okay with you, Mallory. So Vice Chair Pappen, why don't you go ahead and make your comments, and we'll move on from there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I greatly appreciate it. First and foremost, my jurisdiction specifically appreciates the allocations that are given here rather than targets as a best way to implement the region's vision, as well as meeting each county's priorities as we move forward here. We would like to see or continue allowing the counties to define proximate access to the PDAs. Our county has about 22 of them, and they're largely linear. So along Caltrain and El Camino, we need to define the definition of proximate access that allows us to invest in how residents and employees get to and from the PDAs and in between. And a second point here, we would like to see, and I think this is kind of along the lines with most of the counties here, that the county share be 50% instead of the current designation, which I believe is 45-55. We can really put the 2050 plan principles to use if we have that flexibility and get the 50%. And as a final note, we support flexibility for the CTAs, which we hope in the future will include green infrastructure goals or criteria. And that's it. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I just needed to get that on the record.
No, we appreciate that, and thank you very much. And thank you for staff for that indulgence. And with that, I will turn over to Ms. Atkinson for a presentation.
Great, thank you very much, commissioners. My name is Mallory Atkinson, and I'll be giving an information item today seeking input from the committee on the policy and investment priorities for the next cycle of the One Bay Area Grant Program. And I think we have a presentation coming. Thank you. So the next slide, please. So as a reminder, and to set the context for this program, the One Bay Area Grant, or OBAG program, is the policy framework that the Commission has used in recent years to distribute our region's shares of the Federal Highway Administration funds, specifically funds from the Surface Transportation Program and the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Improvement Program, or SDP and CMAQ. The program framework does provide the Commission with a valuable opportunity to use these flexible funds to tackle several interconnected regional objectives. However, these specific federal fund sources account for only a small share of the available revenues, or 1.3% of all transportation revenues planned for Plan Bay Area 2050. So therefore, it's important to think of the role of the OBAG program as one part of a comprehensive regional investment strategy. Next slide, please. For context, as a reminder of what we've done for the OBAG program these last two cycles, when we refer to the OBAG program, it really includes both the county program to invest in community-based transportation projects to reinforce our regional growth objectives, but also a regional program with funding for new initiatives and pilots and projects that are well suited for region-wide implementation. And both of these two program components have worked together to support our Plan Bay Area. Next slide, please. So looking closer now at that county portion of the program, specifically within the One Bay Area Grant, or OBAG 2 cycle, the themes of housing and focused growth are woven throughout the county program, with the housing factors included in the formula for distributing the funds between counties. And you can see that in the pie chart at the top right, with RHNA and affordable housing production included in the distribution. Housing is also included in the scoring criteria that CTAs use to evaluate projects. And CTAs are required to focus their investments within priority development areas within each county. And importantly, within the county program, it requires cities to demonstrate compliance with priority state housing laws in order to maintain eligibility for program funding. And another important program or element of the county program is the unique and valuable partnership that we have with our county transportation agencies, the CTAs, through which we have given them flexibility to identify and recommend those projects within their counties that best support our regional objectives while also meeting their local community needs. So next slide, please. Onto the regional program within the OBAG 2. These funds are used to advance programs that directly address our plan goals and our requirements for focused growth and emissions reductions, specifically through the Climate Initiatives Program, additional PDA planning and investments in priority conservation areas, and launching innovative efforts on the housing front. And within OBAG 2, this was used to launch our housing incentive pool and also the Bay Area Preservation Pilot. The regional program also focuses on making progress on other plan strategies at a regional scale, such as BART car replacements, Clipper, and various bridge forward investments. Next slide, please. So with the current OBAG 2 framework in mind, now shifting to look ahead at the next cycle and recognizing that a lot has changed since the OBAG 2 program was adopted, we have identified several overarching considerations to help guide the development of OBAG 3. Next slide, please. So first off, Staff recently completed a combined assessment of our priority development areas and One Bay Area grant, which concluded with the recommendations to continue going forward with an overall approach to focus our investments in priority growth areas and to give more time to allow for an evaluation of how effective that might be over a longer time period. And also to continue to leverage program funding as a mechanism to encourage jurisdictions to adopt priority policies. And in the past, we've done that to encourage cities to comply with existing state laws and state directives. The study also recommends to strengthen the effectiveness of future cycles by establishing clear goals for the overall program at the outset, which will allow us to better evaluate the success of our program. And then within the county side, to standardize how counties evaluate or standardize the project evaluation processes between counties. And there's additional information on the recommendations and findings from this study included in your packet for this item. Next slide, please. Another consideration is with the adoption of the new plan in the next coming months, the OBAG 3 program will need to consider what changes might be needed to better support both our ongoing and longstanding plan priorities, such as maintaining and optimizing the existing transportation system, but also how to adapt to new strategies that are included in the plan, such as climate adaptation and resilience. And of course, a single program like OBAG will be insufficient to make progress on any one strategy alone, let alone 35 strategies. The program can play an important role when it's focused and complemented with other fund sources as part of an overall strategy. Next slide, please. In recent years, the Commission has undertaken several major policy initiatives, which will need to be taken into consideration within the development of OBAG 3. This includes direction on connecting transportation funds to housing, the adoption of a regional safety and Vision Zero policy, an equity platform, the recent approval of the Express Lane Strategic Plan, and the forthcoming Transit Transformative Action Plan. And in addition to these various policy initiatives, the mobility landscape of the Bay Area has changed within the last year or so. And so we'll need to consider if changes are needed in the existing program framework to adapt to those changing travel behaviors to meet the needs of residents and communities, both throughout the pandemic and then after. Next slide, please. And the OBAG 3 program also provides an opportunity to advance equity by investing our resources through the program at a meaningful scale to address or to support the historically and systemically underserved and marginalized groups, to live up to the values of our equity platform. A consideration for equity will need to be woven throughout the program, OBAG 3 program's regional and county investments and policies. Next slide, please. And finally, MTC's federal recertification review last year highlighted a need to demonstrate that our processes for the OBAG program for programming of STP and CMAQ funds are consistent with federal requirements. We believe much of this can be addressed through improved documentation and clarification of our program processes. However, we will need to consider some changes in our funding distribution and project selection processes. Next slide, please. So with that context of the existing OBAG framework and the key considerations that we've been thinking through this spring, we are asking for Commission input and direction in a few areas, which we're posing to you today as a series of discussion questions. The first set of these questions is focused on policy priorities, which really aim to get at what are the key priorities and desired outcomes of the Commission for the next OBAG program. What elements of the existing OBAG framework are working and should continue or should be emphasized or increased going forward? And how can we best achieve our priority outcomes through our shared regional and county framework and our partnership with the CTAs? And then the next slide, please, shifts to questions that deal with OBAG in context of other current or future revenues. So how should complementary revenue sources influence the priorities for OBAG? And this does the influx of ARP funding or the upcoming to be distributed state surplus, do those change the priority focus for OBAG 3? And with a new federal surface transportation authorization in the works, How should any additional funding programs distributed to the region, either through new federal programs or increased revenue levels, how should those be leveraged within the OBAG 3 program, either through new programs that aren't already in the program or strategic increases to existing programs? And finally, a note that ongoing efforts through OBAG, as well as any new initiatives that are prioritized by the Commission, will need sustainable staffing levels in order to be effective going forward. So the last slide, please. I'll conclude my portion of this presentation with a look ahead at the schedule for the development of the framework. With your input today and then additional engagement with our partners and stakeholders throughout the summer, staff will develop a draft framework to bring back to the Commission this fall. We're targeting October with a program adoption in December. As a reminder, this item today is for information only, but we are asking for your feedback and input on the investment and policy priorities that we should be focusing on in developing the OBAG 3 framework. With that, I'd open it up for discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And I'll look to my colleagues to see if there are questions, comments, or concerns. And Commissioner Chavez.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering, you know, based on the comments that I know our earlier commissioner made before she left, could you talk just a little bit about the issue she raised relative to the proximity of PDAs, and maybe help us understand a little bit more about what she was raising and whether or not that's an issue that you're sort of seeing in the 9 Berea counties overall?
Yeah, the one issue that the Commissioner raised about allowing counties to continue to define proximate access. In our current program framework, we require each county to focus their investments within priority development areas. And each county is given a target for how much they need to invest in those areas. And as part of that, each county is then given the opportunity to define, for projects that aren't directly located in a PDA, to define other projects that support a PDA by improving proximate or providing proximate access to a PDA. And so each CTA has developed a definition for how to decide whether a project should be counted for supporting a PDA or those PDA investment targets. And we have heard that from the similar feedback from San Mateo County and other counties, but it is something that we think that we need to standardize in order to better evaluate the program's effectiveness going forward. And so we are hoping to work with our CTA partners to come up with a definition for what projects provide improved access to PDAs that we can all agree on.
And I wondered, you know, I was reading a study, maybe this might have been I don't know, it's pre-COVID or post-COVID, but it was a little bit about how far people are walking based on the, you know, using active transportation based on the access points, you know, whether that's trails, bridges, or that kind of connection. And I wonder if there is any, for lack of a better word, sort of accepted research on on how far someone really will go if the trail is improved or the walkway is improved or the lights are signalized, something that would give us a little more objective framework. And part of the reason I'm asking the question is that in some of the areas that we built out in Santa Clara County, where I've seen a lot of density, we've had great density, good proximity, but not great access. Right? So, I mean, David, I know as an architect, you probably see that all the time where someone is thinking that the outcome is going to be people will easily cross this to get from one point to another. And I don't necessarily see evidence of that. So some of it I think is so design related. That's partly why I'm asking the question if there is any standards around that.
I'm sure that there are, and we will definitely look to those standards to develop something that could be more objective.
This is Alex Bockelman, sorry, Deputy Executive Director for Policy again. You know, we have used standards in the past for our TOD policy, but I think what you're raising is whether or not there's sort of newer information, especially, you know, with the newer mobility options and even, you know, having just been through a pandemic, you know, is there sort of evolving data that would suggest that people are willing to go further? So we can certainly look into that. We have, used literature in the past, but I think the question of whether the acceptable length has gotten longer is a good one that we can look into.
Alex, part of what made me think about it is how many people are using motorized bikes now and motorized scooters, which are different than, just regular old pedals. But yeah, that would be great. And then my other question is, what is the tool, the series of tools used to assess whether or not we are in fact advancing equity? And what I really want to understand is, how do you take what you know about a region in advance of any improvements to determine whether or not the project enhances equity? And then what is, again, are there measurements that you're using that are relatively standard for post and improvement?
I think you raised really great questions. I don't think we have a lot of tools for assessing, especially on the programmatic side, the equity impacts of a program. We do know that investing within and supporting the community-based transportation plans, and then actually investing in building out those plans, is one way that we can support equity. But there's a lack of good tools to evaluate the equity outcomes of especially these smaller sized projects that we see in the OBAG program.
One recommendation I would make, and I don't have an answer to this. I'm not proposing one. I just was really interested because I'm interested in learning about, how investments, how our investments are impacting anti-displacement strategies. Like there are ripple effects to these investments that we just need to really deeply understand. But I ask it more because it seems to me that one area that we could perhaps improve is in making sure that we're really speaking to the impacted communities. I like one of the points that you raised was having community support for a project. In some of the low income areas that I represent, getting community support takes a ton of work because the engagement level is so dramatically different that even that may negate the ability, the actual equity measure, because really the measure is, are we spending the time to get out into that community to even lift that project up in the first place to bring it forward? So I just would want us to be thinking about who the leaders are in the different communities so that we can ask questions. And even if a smaller segment of them would be quantitative versus qualitative, again, I don't have an answer to it. It's really something I've been struggling with in my own region, which is why I'm asking. If you already have the playbook, I'd love to take it. But if not, I'd be really interested in us learning together, and also recommend that the air quality, the air district is also doing some really interesting work around this subject as well, relative to investments. And they're creating a whole new board to help assess those. And I might recommend that there would be value in better understanding the process they're using to create both the community committee, but how they're learning. And I know you all know Veronica Eady. She's fabulous and just would be a good thought partner, I think, to learn what they're doing, and then from them, frankly, to learn from you. Thank you.
Just if I could, just to add on, and to just a critical point, Commissioner Chavez, you just raised, very often, particularly for small infrastructure that is community oriented, what we as planners think a community needs may not be what the community itself believes that it needs from their experience on the ground. It's something I felt very deeply in LA Metro and learned a lot from that process. In fact, basically that sort of launched the equity platform in many ways for me. But I think, to your point, just making sure that with intention we invest in the outreach and the engagement so we can hear from community members themselves what works for them, particularly those who have not had a voice very often in things like infrastructure design and the like, or access to, more traditional ways of deciding projects, is, I think, absolutely essential to infusing equity in the process that you're speaking to.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just share with my colleagues, if you'll permit me, Chair, just an experience I had. We built out a beautiful bilingual, bicultural library in a very, very gang impacted community. And I was so excited to go meet with the neighbors and I was a brand new council member. So my predecessor had worked on it. So I went out to meet with the community to say, how would you like to celebrate? What should the grand opening look like? And they had decided to boycott it. And the reason they had decided to boycott the opening of this unbelievable library was that what they'd asked the city for was to put in proper drainage on a street that's right next to the library, and that it didn't drain properly. And it was the main ingress and egress to a school that was right behind this library. And it would have been the second main ingress into the plaza that was built. And they could not believe that the city just hadn't put in the proper drainage. And so they were completely upset. And frankly, once we got that fixed, which was so minor, it was such a minor thing that they felt unheard, even though this big investment had happened. The city was like, why are they so upset? So anyway, a lot to learn. I think, Therese, your point is just really well taken.
Appreciate that very much. And I know that staff received a memo as well from Vice Chair Pappen. I think in San Mateo County, she notes that there's 22 PDAs and they're mostly along the Caltrain and El Camino corridor. So how do you get from one to the other? Which is actually interesting. And I think that there's many corridors around the entire Bay Area that are similar, maybe further dispersed and a little, the profile might be different, but I think it is an interesting piece to work on. I will say I'm always biased as an architect that if you make a walk enjoyable and it's beautiful and scenic, people will walk further. If it's a horrible place to be, they don't want to go at all. And, it's just human nature. So I do appreciate that. Personally, I don't see any other, Commissioner Josefowicz.
I don't want to interrupt you, Chair.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to kind of, respond to, I think, some of the questions that you put up, Mallory. I mean, I think this is a really, in-depth presentation, and I haven't fully gone through the report on the previous OBAG rounds, but it's great that we're doing that analysis and kind of learning from it. And I just, really wanted to encourage you to kind of take the direct, to kind of sort of offer up some options in the directions that I think were in the presentation around really incorporating equity deeply into sort of the OBAG 3 process, really sort of doing what we can to make sure that OBAG 3 is driving PBA outcomes, not just in terms of the projects that it's funding, but it seems like one of the things that you've highlighted is success that OBAG 2 has had in kind of encouraging sort of different communities to kind of do the right thing in other aspects in order to be able to access this funding. And so I think there's a real opportunity to kind of continue to extend that. And, the things that communities we now know have to be doing as are laid out in the plan or in the draft plan are different than they were like when we put together OBAG 2. And so I hope we can kind of be thoughtful as how and sort of collaborative in how we update that. And then I think there's some specific programs, that worked really well in OBAG 2, like the HIP program that Commissioner Spearing and I worked on, and others. And I think it's just a real opportunity to continue sort of working with jurisdictions to help us kind of not just think about transportation on its own, but thinking about how we can kind of combine transportation and land use to achieve all of the goals that we're trying to achieve around affordability and equity and climate and VMT reduction, traffic reduction, et cetera, in the plan. So I don't know, I think you're doing all the right work if we kind of come back with something that reflects a lot of the things that were kind of put up in the slide deck.
Great point. Anyone else have anything to offer? The one last thing I was going to say, I also agree with Vice Chair Pappen. I see that the OBAG 1 grant cycle had 40% of the counties. OBAG 2 had 45. I think we should continue that trend and have OBAG 3 be 50. I'll just put that out there on that piece. I also think that our CTAs are doing, like MTC, adopting a whole new workload that needs to also be reflected to make sure that we can have the best information and coordination at the local level as possible as well, and be able to pay for that. So I do appreciate that. This is an informational item. I'll look to Kimberly if there's anyone from the public who'd like to speak on this item before we move on.
I see only Randi Kinman has her hand raised at this time. And if you'd like to unmute yourself, Ms. Kinman, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'm speaking on behalf of the Policy Advisory Council. I just want to reinforce the equity issue from all lenses. And I think that we recognize that development goes into already disadvantaged communities quite often. And we can't just look at access to transit. We have to make sure that all the other things are available close by or within the PDAs themselves. I'm personally surrounded by 4 PDAs that have been approved and are online. I have probably 30 to 50,000 people potentially moving in, businesses moving in. I have not 1 square foot of new park space. So from an equity perspective, in a neighborhood that is pretty large, that has no park or open space, that form of looking through a lens is not present. And I just want to make sure that we're reinforcing things like parks, access to grocery stores, access to amenities, and that we're not just creating new strips of new development. Thank you.
Thank you. Kimberly, I don't see any hands raised on our attendees list.
No, I don't see any raised hands, and I've received nothing in writing for this item.
And again, I would just say thank you very much, Mallory, for the great work. I agree with Commissioner Josefowicz in terms of applying some of those issues that we've already kind of put forward into that work and going forward. Very much appreciate that. And it is an informational item. So with that, we will move on to item 4A, which is the California Transportation Commission update. And Kenneth Cow will present this item. Kenneth.
Thank you, Chair Rabbit. Kenneth Cow with programming staff. Here to provide you with an update on the California Transportation Commission. The CTC did meet June 23rd and 24th online and approved a number of items, one of which was to approve the regional programming for the federal COVID relief funds. The region got about $65 million of that, and the commission approved much of that programming last month, and the CTC approved that last month as well. The CTC also approved the Active Transportation Program, Cycle 5, the regional program, that included about $37 million in new funding for Bay Area projects. And we'll be working with the ATP sponsors to deliver those projects very soon. And I did also want to mention that there is an approval in the state budget of additional funds and augmentation to the Active Transportation Program. However, that is subject to future legislation. So MTC staff is working very closely with Caltrans and CTC to look at the additional projects that could be funded pending the additional legislation to enable the additional ATP augmentation funds. I did also want to mention, as a part of the state budget, that the budget included a large chunk of new monies for the State Highway Operations and Protection Program, or the SHOP, that mainly goes to state highways. And I wanted to mention that the Bay Area Toll Authority is working and has submitted a letter to the state requesting additional funds to support bridge maintenance projects, which are usually funded by tolls. But as you know, toll revenue has been impacted by COVID-19. And so I understand BATA is looking for some additional funds, additional help from the state to help with those projects. Finally, I did want to mention that the 2022 State Transportation Improvement Program, or the STIP, is beginning and is underway. The state did release the fund estimate, which shows about $97 million in additional funds to the Bay Area over the next 5 years. So we'll be bringing an item back to this committee in September with policies and procedures and a vision on programming those funds. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. The next meeting of the CTC will be August 18th and 19th, to be held online and also in Sacramento. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. Appreciate that. Any questions, comments, concerns from anyone? Always appreciate the update. Thank you very much. I'll ask Kimberly if there's any public comments received associated to this item or the last one, or if there's anyone from the public who'd like to speak on this item.
I've received nothing in writing, and I see no member of the public with their hand raised at this time.
Okay, great. With that, we'll move on then to item number 5, which is public comment, other business. And I'll look back to Kimberly if there's anyone. I see one hand raised. Kimberly?
I've received nothing in writing, and I do see Roland LeBrun. Please go ahead and unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to preface what I'm about to say by saying that I'm not comfortable saying what I'm about to say, but here it goes anyway. Rescuing VTA from its current predicament is one thing, but rescuing a failed $10 billion BART project is an entirely different proposition. So today, I am recommending that MTC initiate an external management audit of the agency and the agency's 10-year capital plan in particular, specifically the decision to select a federal funding plan for the BART extension that reduces federal project oversight at the cost of a maximum 25% federal contribution to the project. In closing, I believe that at the end of the day, this audit may well reveal significant issues at VTA, which are likely to ultimately impact transit across the entire region, not just Santa Clara County. And I also believe that there is a remote chance that such an audit might reveal that the recent tragedy was actually a symptom of internal problems rather than the cause of the collapse of the agency. Thank you.
I have no additional raised hands, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you very much. With that, we'll move on to agenda item number 6, which is our adjournment. The next meeting of the Programming and Allocations Committee is scheduled to be held on Wednesday, September 8th, 9:45 a.m., remotely and by webcast as appropriate, depending on the status of the shelter-in-place orders. We must be getting close at that point in time to being back in the same room together. But very much appreciate, as always, staff's good work, and thank you everyone for the conversation and discussion today. And our meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.